£6 buys you a ruin, girl. Beg at my door by frost. 12 paupers, a rotting roof. Trash inherits trash. Perfect.
She took the deed without a word and opened her ledger.
The Foundress charter was never broken, only sealed.
Charter? You can't even read, you gutter foundling.
Then read it yourself. Every family owes this house.
By first frost, every name in the parish was in her book. The man who laughed would be the first to pay. Would you take the thing a laughing man handed you if he had already decided it would be the ruin of you? Esther Longmire took it. She stood in the damp little parish office at Draycott Cross, with the ink still wet on the deed, and she did not let her hand shake as she folded the paper and slid it into the breast of her slate-grey dress. The rain ran down the one small window in threads. Silas Thorncombe leaned back in his chair, thumbs hooked in the pockets of his bottle-green waistcoat, gold watch chain catching what little light there was, and he watched her the way a man watches a candle he expects the draught to finish. What none of them in that room could see, and what I want you to hold in your mind for the next little while, is that the walls she had just bought were not empty. They were keeping something. Not a curse, whatever the village said, a secret, sealed and patient, waiting nearly 100 years for someone with the eyes to find it. So settle in with me. Let us go back to the flat, wet country of the Cheshire Plain in the year 1834, to a village of stone and coal smoke, where a stranger was an event and a woman alone was a scandal, and to a girl of 19 who had been taught to read a column of figures the way other people read scripture. Before we go further, tell me in the comments what county or what country you are watching from tonight. I do like to know who is sitting by the fire with me. Esther was slight and narrow-shouldered, no more than 5'3", with dark chestnut hair pinned low at the nape and a few loose strands the rain had stuck to her temple. She had steady grey eyes and a light scatter of freckles across the nose, and under one arm, always, she carried a slim brown leather ledger with corners worn soft as cloth. That ledger was the whole of her fortune. A housekeeper named Mrs. Pell had trained her to keep it, in a great cold kitchen where Esther had spent 6 years as a scullery and still-room maid, and Mrs. Pell had said to her once, tapping the page, that a girl who could make numbers tell the truth would never quite starve, whatever men decided about her. Men had decided a good deal about her lately. The house she served had turned her out when the mistress died, out into the rain with one canvas bag, and the only living soul who owed her any connection at all was Thorncombe, the dead mistress's brother-in-law, overseer of the poor for the parish, and he owed her nothing and knew it. He got to his feet now, slow, enjoying it. He tapped the silver top of his cane against the floorboards for the benefit of the 2 churchwardens by the door. "There it is, gentlemen," he said. "Aldermore Almshouse, 12 old paupers and a roof like a wet loaf, signed over to Miss Longmire for the tidy sum of £6. Cheapest funeral in Cheshire." He smiled at his own wit. "I give her till the first frost. She'll bring me that deed back and beg me to take it, and I shall have the pleasure of saying no." The wardens laughed, the small, careful laugh of men who work for the man making the joke. Esther said nothing. She had learned, in 6 years of kitchens, that silence is a kind of wall, and that a certain sort of man will beat himself bloody against it looking for the door. She only inclined her head, as if he had wished her good day, and she saw the smile falter on his ruddy, jowled face, just for a moment, before she turned and walked out into the weather. The lane was mud to the ankle. Draycott Cross watched her go from behind its lace curtains, faces pale as suet at the glass, the shopkeeper on the corner finding sudden, urgent business with his shutters so he would not have to meet her eye. She smelled the village before she saw much of it, wet wool and coal smoke, and the sourness of a midden, and under all of it, the green, cold smell of the plain itself, ditch water and flattened grass going into winter. A woman with a baby on her hips stepped back into a doorway to let her pass and pulled the door to. Not cruelty, only the certainty, shared by every soul behind every window, that this girl was already a ghost, and it was bad luck to be seen greeting one. Esther kept her eyes on the road and her ledger under her arm, and did the only thing she knew how to do with fear, which was to count. 12 paupers, £6 gone, and 11 shillings left in the world. So many mouths, so many days until the parish stipend for their keep was paid, if it was paid, and she did not yet know a single thing about whether it was. Her mind ran down the imagined column of it, need against means, and found the sum frightening, and steadied herself against the fright by naming it exactly. A vague fear will swallow you. A counted one you can carry. Spindle Lane ran off the far end of the village between two blackthorn hedges gone wild, and it had plainly not been mended in a generation. The ruts stood full of brown water. No one came this way. She understood why the moment the hedges fell back, and she saw, at the head of the lane, against a bruised and failing sky, the thing that was now hers. It was long and low and grey, a stone almshouse of 2 stories, with a range of little chimneys down its spine, like the vertebrae of some animal laid out to weather. Ivy had got into the mortar and was prying the stones apart with the slow patience of a burglar. The roof sagged in the middle, where a purlin had given, and along the front the windows stared out, some blind with boards, some stuffed with grey rags against the wind, and the whole of it stood black against that swollen sky, with the last light draining out behind it. She stopped in the mud and looked at it for a long moment while the rain found the back of her neck. Somewhere beyond the walls, a rook complained and went quiet. The house did not welcome her. Houses in that condition never do. They have been left too long alone, and they have learned to keep their own counsel, and they watch a newcomer the way the village had watched her, waiting to see whether she is worth the trouble of yielding to. Esther drew her brown shawl tighter across her chest, shifted the canvas bag, and started up the lane toward it. The door was oak, silvered with age and swollen in its frame, and it took her shoulder twice before it gave. What met her was not sight but smell, the way it always is with a shut-up place. Damp plaster first, that soft grey mushroom smell of lime gone back to mud. Then cold ash, years of it. A hearth that had not been properly cleared in longer than she wanted to think. Then, under those, the particular thick sweetness of old bodies and old bedding, and rooms where the window is never opened because the people in them are always cold. They were sitting in the near room when she stepped in, and they turned their faces to her all at once, and there were 12 of them, and they were afraid of her. That was the thing that undid her, more than the roof or the ruin. 12 old souls, wrapped in what they owned, sat around a mean fire of green sticks, and they looked at the strange young woman in the doorway with the flat dread of people who have learned that any change at all is usually a change for the worse. An old man near the hearth had a cloth cap on indoors, and his hands folded over a stick. A woman beside him had wound herself entirely in a shawl, but for her eyes. "I'm Esther Longmire," she said, and her voice came out steadier than she felt. "The almshouse has come to me. I'm not here to turn any of you out. I'm here to keep it going, if I can find the way." Nobody answered. A coal shifted, but the fear in the room came down by a degree, the way a held breath eases, and one old woman near the window gave a single, small nod, and that nod was the first thing anyone in Draycott Cross had given her freely, and she held on to it. She walked the length of the building before the light went entirely, and what she found frightened her, and something else besides. It was not a house any longer, in the way a house is a thing that shelters and warms. It was a ghost of one, a skeleton standing in its own clothes, the flesh of it long gone to damp and neglect, the bones underneath still square and true. And that was the thing her trained eye kept snagging on, even in the ruin of it. The bones were good, the walls ran plumb. The great beams overhead, where she could see them, were oak as thick as a man's waist and sound as a drum when she rapped them. Somebody, long ago, had built this place to last centuries and had spent real money doing it, and that made no sense at all for a pauper's almshouse at the wrong end of a poor lane. She filed the wrongness of it away, the way Mrs. Pell had taught her to file a discrepancy in the accounts, and she went to make herself a place to sleep. She did not try to conquer the whole ruin that first night. A person who tries to mend everything at once mends nothing. She took the smallest room, at the end past the common hall, a low chamber with a boarded window that the old man in the cap called the warden's room, though there had been no warden in his memory. She swept it. She swept it properly, on her knees, the dust rising grey in the last of the light, and she found under a century of it a stone floor laid in good flags, and she cleared the old hearth of its birds' nests and its soot, and she laid a small, careful fire, with dry kindlings scavenged from a broken settle, and she struck her flint, and the flame caught and took. The light of it went up the sooty back of the chimney and out across the swept flags, and for the first time the room had a centre and a warmth, and Esther sat back on her heels in front of it, with her arms around her knees, and let herself, for the space of a few breaths, simply be alive and dry and out of the rain. It was not much. It was one small square of warm in a great cold ruin. But she had made it herself, out of nothing, and no man had counted it out to her across a desk, and that made it worth more than the deed folded against her breast. Something moved at the door. It came in low and slow, a thin black cat with its ribs showing under its fur, and it stopped at the edge of the firelight and looked at her without any particular hope or fear. She stayed still. The cat considered her, considered the fire, and came the rest of the way in on soundless feet. And it did not climb into her lap or do anything soft. It simply lay down a careful yard from the hearth where the warmth would reach it, and closed its eyes. She found it had a torn ear. She found she was glad of it beyond all sense. "Pilbrow," she said aloud for no reason she could have named, and the cat's ear twitched at the sound and stayed. That was the whole of the ceremony. From that night it was Pilbrow, and from that night she was not entirely alone in the ruin. In the grey of the morning came a knock, and then the door pushed open before she could rise, and a sturdy, broad-hipped woman in her early 40s stood there with a wide wicker basket on her hip and flour still dusted grey across her apron. She had sandy hair coiled under a white cap and warm hazel eyes and a way of standing, hands going to her hips, that took up cheerful room in the doorway. "Bet Ackroyd," she said. "Carter's wife. I bake." She set the basket on the swept flags and took from it 2 brown loaves, still holding the warmth of the oven, and a crock of dripping, and a twist of tea. "Don't thank me. It puts me off. Half the village thinks you're mad, and the other half thinks you're worse, and I think a body's got to eat regardless." She looked around the swept room, at the small fire, at the cat, and something in her face settled, approving, though she said nothing about it. "Now, them old ones need their fire seen to, and there's a pump in the yard seized with rust that I'll get Tom to look at. You start where you can stand, and you don't try to mend the whole ark before breakfast. That's my counsel, and it's free." She did not make a speech of her kindness. She turned it into work and bread and the loan of her husband's arm, and then she was gone back down the lane with her empty basket, and Esther stood holding the warm loaf against her chest and had to breathe carefully for a moment before she could get on. She got on. She opened her ledger to a clean page, and she began, that day, to do the one thing she truly knew how to do, which was to take stock. What the almshouse held, what it owed, what came in and what went out. She walked the rooms and counted blankets and counted mouths and counted the sacks in the cold larder, which numbered too few, and she ruled her lines straight and set the figures down small and exact, and the very act of it steadied the whole trembling enterprise the way a keel steadies a boat. You cannot save a thing you have not first counted. It was 2 days after, carrying a pail to empty in the churchyard corner, that she met the old woman. She was very old and very small, and bent almost double over a knobbed blackthorn stick, wrapped in a black cloak with a knitted scarf over wispy white hair. And she was standing among the leaning stones as though she had grown there. Her eyes were the pale, watery grey of ice on a puddle. She fixed them on Esther, and did not move aside on the narrow path. "You're the one took Aldermore," she said. It was not a question. "I am, Esther Longmire." The old woman studied her for a long moment, and her thin, high brows drew together, and when she spoke again her voice was dry as leaves. "They walled the heart of it up," she said, "so as not to hear it beating. But a wall's only a wall, girl. It keeps a thing in as well as out." And then, before Esther could ask what on earth she meant, Winnie Ashcroft turned on her stick and went off between the graves into the low churchyard mist, one slow, deliberate step at a time, and was gone. Now, let me stop the story for just a moment and ask you plainly, because I am curious. If it were you, standing in a cold ruin with 12 strangers to feed and 11 shillings to your name, and an old woman had said a thing like that to you and walked away, would you have chased her for an answer? Or would you have let it lie and gone back to the only work you knew? Tell me below what you would have done, and if you are enjoying this quiet story of hers, do give it a like and think about subscribing, because it means these long tales find the next person who needs an evening by the fire. There, back to Draycott Cross, and to the thing Esther's trained eye had begun to worry at. It was the warden's room that would not sit right with her. She had lived in it a week now, and the more she scrubbed it, the more one wall troubled her. It was the panelled wall, the inner one, opposite the boarded window, dark old oak wainscot from floor to shoulder height, with plain plaster above. Everywhere else in the almshouse the stone was stone, and the plaster was plaster, and it all agreed with itself about its age. But behind that panelling, where the wainscot met the wall, there was a seam of brickwork showing through a gap, and the mortar in it was pale. Newer, grey and hard, and years younger than the soft, crumbling lime of everything around it. Mrs. Pell's voice came back to her, from a morning long ago over a coal account that would not balance. "Look for the figure that does not belong, girl. The honest ones all sing the same note. It's the false one hums flat, and once you've heard it, you can't unhear it." That mortar hummed flat. She pressed her ear to the panelling and rapped it with her knuckle along its length, patient, the way you sound a beam or a cask. And most of it answered dull and solid, stone behind. But in the middle, over the false brick, it answered wrong. It gave back a low, hollow, breathing sort of note, the note a thing makes when there is emptiness behind it, a space where a space should not be. She stood back from the wall with her heart going and made herself think it through like a column of figures. Someone had bricked up a hollow behind the warden's panelling and skimmed fresh mortar over the brick and hidden the whole business behind the wainscot. That took work. That took intent. You do not go to that trouble to seal an empty cupboard. You do it to keep something. But she had 12 mouths to feed, and a roof letting the sky in, and a hollow in a wall, however wrong it hummed, did not put bread on the common table. So she set it aside. She made herself set it aside, and it would not be set aside. For days it nagged at her while she mended, while she carried water, while she sat over her ledger at night with Pilbrow at the hearth. The false note went on humming under everything, the way an unbalanced account will keep you awake. And she knew, the way you know a thing before you will admit it, that she was going to have to open that wall or never sleep easy in the room again. Meanwhile, the almshouse itself was changing under her hands, and so, by inches, was the village. The seized pump, freed by Tom Ackroyd's spanner, gave clean water into the yard. The common fire burned steady now on dry fuel she had taught the old men to stack and save. The 12, who had been a frightened huddle, began to be people to her, with names and quarrels and small histories, and they began, cautiously, to be less afraid. Word of these things travelled the lane the way all news travelled Draycott Cross, faster than a horse, and the faces at the lace curtains grew a shade less certain of her doom. A man at the smithy gave her a nod one morning. The shopkeeper who had shuttered against her now weighed out her flour without turning away. It was not welcome yet, but it was no longer the road-crossing dread of a ghost, and she felt the difference and kept her head down and let the work go on speaking for her. Thorncombe still expected her to fail. She heard, through Bet, that he had told the vestry the girl was only prolonging the agony, and that the frost would settle it. Let him, she thought, and ruled another line. And then, one grey afternoon, with the 12 fed and the light good through the door, and the whole afternoon her own, she understood at last the shape of the thing she was looking at, and it changed everything. She had been thinking of the almshouse as abandoned, as a thing left to rot from neglect, the way the whole village thought of it. But you do not brick a hollow into a wall and skim it and panel over it out of neglect. Neglect lets things fall open. This had been closed. Deliberately, carefully, by hands that meant it to stay shut until the right person came. The almshouse had not been forgotten, it had been sealed, and a thing that is sealed is a thing that someone believed was worth keeping. She fetched the fire poker and an old chisel Tom had left, and she began. It was slow, ugly work, and it hurt. She worked the panelling loose first, easing the old pins, and set the boards aside whole because she could not afford to break them. Then she went at the false brick with the chisel and the poker, driving the point into the pale mortar and levering, one brick and then another, and the mortar was hard, and her hands blistered, and then the blisters broke, and still she worked, because now that she had begun, she could no more stop than she could have stopped the humming of that flat note. Dust caked her wet face grey. The light failed, and she lit a candle and went on. It took the rest of that day and a good part of the next. And when at last a whole course of brick came free, and she reached in and pulled the loose ones toward her, and opened a gap the size of a window into the dark behind, the thing that breathed out over her hand in the candlelight was not the foul, wet stink of a sealed, rotten space. It was dry. It was clean. It was cool, still, ancient air that had not stirred since before her grandmother was born, and it carried only the faint smell of old iron and old paper. And she knew in that instant, with her cheek at the cold edge of the brick, that whatever was in there had been protected, that rot means neglect, but dry air means somebody cared. And she took up the candle and held it to the hole. The light fell on a small vaulted recess, no bigger than a hearth, dry-lined with brick. And squarely in the middle of it, sitting on a stone shelf under a fur of dust so fine it had barely settled, stood an iron strongbox, banded and hasped, its lock furred orange but whole, waiting exactly where it had been set down 100 years before, for the hand that would finally come for it. Esther knelt in the broken wall a long time before she reached in, as though the box might be a living thing she could startle. Then she drew it out, and it was heavy, and she carried it to the swept flags before the fire and set it down, and Pilbrow came and sat at the edge of the light to watch with her. The lock would not turn, but the hasp was only rusted, and a few careful blows with the poker sheared it. She lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in oiled cloth gone stiff as board, lay papers. A great folded document of heavy parchment, sealed with a disc of red wax, stamped with a crest she did not know. And beneath it, a book, bound in cracked leather, its pages close written in a firm, old-fashioned hand, and laid on top of both a single letter, folded and sealed, and across its face, in that same firm hand, browned but perfectly clear in the candlelight, were written the words, "To the soul who keeps this house when I am dust." Her fingers were not quite steady as she broke that seal. The letter was from a woman named Dame Cecily Harnwell, and it was dated in the year 1741, and Esther read it through twice by the light of the little fire, while the 12 slept, and the cat watched, and the wind moved in the ruined chimneys. And by the end of it, she understood everything, and understood that nothing in Draycott Cross would ever be the same. Dame Cecily had founded the almshouse. She had built it, with her own money, out of the good stone Esther had marvelled at, and she had built it well on purpose, to outlast the men she did not trust. She wrote, in the journal that lay beneath the letter, in her own plain, unsparing voice, of how she had lost her husband and her sons young, and been left rich and alone, and surrounded by relatives and gentlemen of the parish who counted her fortune like carrion. And she wrote of how she had resolved that her money should go not to them, but to the poorest and oldest souls of the village who had no one, and how she had endowed the almshouse to keep them forever, so that there should always be 12 beds and a fire and bread beneath that roof. But she had known the men would try to break it the moment she was dead. So she had done a clever and a careful thing. She had drawn up a charter, the great sealed parchment under the letter, and had it witnessed and enrolled and lodged in law. And by it she had endowed the almshouse not with a sum of money that could be spent or stolen, but with a perpetual entitlement. A fixed and everlasting due charged upon the land itself, upon the named Aldermore fields, upon the parish mill, and, in her own steady words that Esther read aloud into the empty room because they were too great to read in silence. So long as one poor soul is kept beneath this roof, the lands and hearths of Draycott Cross shall render their due unto Aldermore, and no man may withhold it. Every hearth, every household in the parish, a small fixed rent owed to the almshouse, charged upon them by a foundress 100 years dead and enrolled in law, payable so long as a single pauper was sheltered under the roof Esther had bought for £6. And the men had done exactly what Dame Cecily foresaw. They had not been able to overturn the charter, so they had done the next thing. They had hidden it. Some overseer or squire of long ago, finding the entitlement inconvenient, had taken the sealed charter that should have hung framed in the common hall and walled it up in the warden's room, and let the story die, and let the village forget it had ever owed the almshouse a farthing, and let the place fall toward ruin in the hope that ruin would finish what law would not. For near 100 years the dues had gone uncollected because no one living knew they existed. The almshouse had starved on a fortune it could not remember it possessed. Esther sat with the ledger of her own making open beside the dead woman's charter, and she understood that the two were the same instrument reaching across a century. One hand ruling lines, the other had ruled before her. And slowly, deliberately, she began to write the names. Every household in Draycott Cross, every hearth, written into her ledger against the due it owed, exactly as the charter said it must. Not for herself, never for herself, but for the 12 sleeping souls and the ones who would come after them. She was still writing when the storm broke. It came off the plain in the black middle of the night, with no more warning than a change in the note of the wind. And then it was on the almshouse all at once, a great howling weight of it that shook the oak door in its frame and drove the rain flat against the walls. Esther woke to it, and to the sound she had been dreading since her first night under that sagging roof, the deep groan and then the crack of the failing purlin overhead as the wind got under the slates and lifted them. Cold water came through the ceiling of the common hall in a black sheet. The 12 were awake and crying out in the dark, and she was up and among them with a candle guttering in her fist, moving beds, dragging the old ones by their thin arms out from under the falling wet. And the wind screamed, and a whole run of slates went off the roof into the night like a hand of thrown cards, and weeks of her patient mending came undone above her head in the space of a few minutes. And into the very heart of it, over the roar of the wind, came a hammering at the door. She hauled it open against the gale, and there were strangers on her step, drenched and shaking, a man holding up an older woman who could barely stand, and behind them a cart tipped in the flooded ruts of Spindle Lane with a horse plunging in its traces. Travellers, caught by the storm on the open road, who had seen the one light in the one house at the end of the lane and come to it as beasts come to a fire. There was no thought in it. That is the thing I want you to understand, that there was no calculation, no weighing of cost, though the cost was real, and she knew it even as she moved. She brought them in. She brought them into the one dry corner she had left, the swept warden's room with its small fire, and she gave the shaking old woman her own blanket off her own bed, and she gave the man the last of Bet's brown bread from the crock, the last food in the house until morning, and she went back out into the storm with him to cut the poor horse loose and get it under what was left of the byre roof. She lost her shawl to the wind doing it. She came back soaked to the bone and shivering, and she had given away her blanket and her bread and her dry corner to strangers she had never seen, while the rain came down through her own broken roof onto the boards, and she did not for one moment consider doing otherwise. Dame Cecily's charter lay safe in its iron box by the hearth, so long as one poor soul is kept beneath this roof. That night, there were 15 souls kept beneath that broken roof, and the woman who had been given the ruin for a joke crouched wet and shaking among them, and tended the fire, and counted heads until the grey light came, and the wind, at last, fell away. The travellers, it turned out, were not nobody. The old woman Esther had wrapped in her own blanket was mother to a man of some standing in the county town, and her son, when he came for her the next day with dry cloaks and real gratitude, and heard the whole strange story of the almshouse and the walled-up charter, knew exactly the man to send. Not a favour, a professional, an honest county solicitor of good name, who came out to Spindle Lane within the week and sat at Esther's swept table and read the parchment through with a glass, slowly, twice, in complete silence. When he set it down, he took his spectacles off and looked at her for a moment, as if seeing her properly. "Miss Longmire," he said, "I have practiced the law in this county for 30 years, and I have never held a document like this in my hands. It is genuine. It was properly witnessed, and it was enrolled. And I have this morning confirmed the enrolment still stands in the county records, which no one has troubled to look at in living memory. The entitlement is valid. It is charged upon the land, and it runs with the land. And it is binding upon every household named in the tithe of this parish, and it has never been lawfully extinguished. It was merely hidden. Hidden is not the same as gone." He tapped the parchment. "So long as one pauper is kept beneath this roof, this parish owes Aldermore its due, and it has owed it, uncollected, for the better part of a century. You are, in law, entirely within your right to collect it, going forward at the least, and no man in Draycott Cross can withhold it from you." Word of that verdict went down Spindle Lane and into the village faster than any storm, and the change it worked was a thing to see. The families who had crossed the road from her, who had shuttered their windows and pitied her and waited for her to fail, understood all at once that the mad girl at the ruin held a lawful claim upon their own hearths, a claim 100 years old and proof against argument, and that her goodwill was now a thing they very much needed. The shopkeeper sent flour up the lane unasked. The smith came and looked at her roof for nothing. There was no crowing in it, and Esther allowed none. She met them all the same way she had met Thorncombe's laughter, with a level grey eye and a quiet word, and she let them see at once the thing that mattered most, which was that she did not mean to ruin a single family with the due. The charter set the rents small and fixed. She would collect them as Dame Cecily had meant them collected, gently, to keep 12 souls fed, and not a penny past it. Thorncombe came last of all. He came up Spindle Lane in his black frock coat with his silver-topped cane, past the pump that ran clean now and the roof that men were mending, and he stood in the doorway of the warden's room, where the strongbox sat open on the table, with the great sealed charter beside it, and the solicitor's letter under it, and he read enough to understand. Esther watched him read it. She said nothing. She had learned long ago that a silence will do what no shouting can. His ruddy face went a strange grey. His mouth worked once. He had come up that lane, she thought, still half meaning to make his old joke about the first frost. And there was no frost. And there was no joke. And there was nothing in the world he could say that the parchment on the table did not answer before he opened his mouth. He looked at the charter, and he looked at the girl he had counted £6 across a desk to be rid of, and he found he had not one word. He turned, and he went back down the lane, tapping his cane in the mud, and he did not come again. A year is a long time in a place like Draycott Cross, and a short one. Come the next autumn, the Almshouse on Spindle Lane was not grand. It was never going to be grand, and Esther never tried to make it so. But it was whole. The roof was sound and did not let the sky in. The windows held glass again, real leaded glass, and the panelling of the warden's room was back in its place, save that now the charter of Dame Cecily Harnwell hung framed above the hearth in the common hall, where the Foundress had always meant it to hang, so that every soul who warmed themselves beneath it could see the promise that kept them. The 12 beds were 12 beds still, filled and refilled as old souls went and new ones came in off the cold, and there was always bread on the table and a fire in the grate, rendered up by the fixed and modest dues of a parish that had spent 100 years forgetting it owed them. They greeted her by name now, the whole village, all down the lane, and somewhere in that year, without anyone deciding it, she had stopped being Miss Longmire, the mad girl, and become something else. The keeper of Aldermore, they called her, not the owner. She would not have that word, and she said so plainly to any who used it. She had been offered money, real money, by men who saw what the charter was worth and wished to buy the almshouse and the entitlement together and squeeze the parish hard. She turned every one of them from the door. The charter was not a fortune to be sold. It was a trust to be kept, and she meant to keep it as it had been kept for her, sealed up and waiting, across 100 years, by a woman the world had counted for nothing. Bet Ackroyd found her one evening at the common table, with her worn brown ledger open and the framed charter glowing above the fire, and set down a fresh loaf, and stood a moment looking at the pair of them, the old parchment and the new ruled page. "You could have been rich off that, you know," Bet said. "Sold it up and gone to live soft. Nobody would have blamed you." Esther looked up at her, and at the 12 about the fire, and at Pilbrow asleep on the warm flags, and she said the only thing there was to say. "They didn't leave me a fortune to spend, Bet. They left me one to tend." She did not explain it. Bet did not ask her to. Some things a body understands the first time or never, and Bet Ackroyd had understood it long before Esther said it, over a basket of warm bread on a cold first morning. Silas Thorncombe had stood in a dry parish office and told a roomful of laughing men that the girl would be begging at his door by the first frost. The frost came and went and came again a year on, and it was not she who was ever seen at any man's door with her hand out. It was the parish that came up Spindle Lane, hat in hand, to the ruin they had crossed the road to avoid, and the girl within it kept the fire lit for them all. So that is the story I wanted to tell you tonight, of a house given as an insult that turned out to be a key, and of a young woman who understood that the worth of a thing is never what it fetches on a ledger, but only ever what someone is willing to keep. Thank you for sitting with me all the way to the end of it. It means more than you know that you stayed. If it moved you, do leave it a like so the next weary soul finds their evening by this fire. And if you would like more of these quiet tales of the overlooked and the outcast, then come and subscribe, and I will keep telling them. And before you go, tell me this in the comments, and think on it honestly. What forgotten and unloved thing in your own life, some ruin you were handed and told was worthless, might be only waiting, sealed and patient behind its wall, for you to be the one who finally tends it? I would dearly like to know. Until the next lane, and the next locked door,